J Barber. I'm Bill LePage.
Perfect. Great. And now, if you could just tell me your story of how you came to Barber.
Well, you could say in the beginning I was fortunate that I was born into a family that my mother and father were seekers, which wasn't obvious at first but became clear later. But they were churchgoers, Church of Christ, Protestant, very dull, very conservative, very narrow in view. But I was taken every Sunday to church, sent to Sunday school, and then I think you could say influenced by my sister, who's 5 years older than me. I only have one sister. And she had already broken out from the you could say the conservative upbringing. Very, what would you say, very middle class. We weren't at all wealthy. I mean, we actually were poor. But my father was a salesman, and my mother had been a dressmaker, and she made clothes for us, that sort of thing, in order to survive. Went through the Depression. Anyway, the thing is that at 14 I rebelled about the Sunday school classes. They weren't answering my questions. I have no idea what I asked or what it was about. But anyway, I was, had decided, influenced by my sister, who was moving out, meeting people of different views. I went with her to attend communist meetings, socialist meetings, music studies, all sorts of things, but all through it there was that continuing interest in God. It was natural. Okay. My final year of high school, it was predicted quite definitely that I would not pass Latin. Latin was one of the subjects necessary for completion for the certificate, the high school certificate, and it was quite clear that I was going to fail. Why, I don't know, but I suddenly got into my head, I'm going to pass. It was the only thing I studied, and I practically learned 600 lines of Virgil off by heart. I have no idea how I did it, but to the teacher's amazement, I passed. Therefore, I had a high school certificate, the final certificate, whatever it's called. And then the Japanese entered the war. This is 1942, and I thought, I should perhaps try and do something, and so I joined the medical corps. And I was 17. And anyway, I finished the war. The details don't matter. The main thing being that because I was in the services, I should point out that during those years, 42, early 42, I joined up, and to 45, I was discharged on the 14th of August, my birthday. No. Yes, it was. It was my birthday. 45. I was 21, and but during those years, I would get leave because I didn't go out of Australia. Well, I I better mention it. I mean,
Yes.
it is relevant. I got bored. Nothing was happening with the medical corps. 17, I wanted to sort of do something, and an Air Force recruiting officer came round, and I said, "Oh, that'll do. The Air Force." It was pure boredom. That was all, and I found myself a pilot. I liked flying, but once I graduated as a pilot, in the process I realised I don't want to bomb people. That was not. I'm happy to help, but I don't want to kill or bomb people, and they believed that they accepted my plea, and I became what you might call a staff pilot. So I continued flying, which I enjoyed, but I didn't go out of Australia. And as a result, during my leave, my parents, by this time, had left the church, fed up with the narrowness, the lack of heart, you could say, and explored theosophy, Christian Science, this or that. And as it happened, when I would go on leave, I'd go with them to also explore. But nothing, again, they didn't and I didn't settle on anything, but that continuing interest in God. And I'd even have books with me that, so I was discharged at 45, and I had no idea. I had no ambition. I didn't think of, well, what am I going to do? I had no vision. But the government announced that seeing that this was one of the measures introduced by the Australian government, that people who'd been in the services during the war, who had the high school certificate, could go to university and be paid £2 a week. It was the £2 a week that appealed to me. To be honest, university meant nothing to me. My family were not from university. There was nothing like that. We were all simple people. But £2 a week, that's wonderful. Living at home, nice pocket money. So I said yes, and I went with my sister. By this time had married, and he was also qualified to do the same, and I went with him to register, and he said, "I'm going to do psychology." And I said, "Oh, that'll do." It wasn't, if he'd said architecture, if he'd said engineer, I would have said, yeah, okay. I was only interested in the £2. But at the same time, when I reflect, I thought, psychology, well, that might sort of tell me something. Well, about what life meant. What was the purpose of it? I was by this time I was restless, and well, what was life about? But not very articulate, not very clear in my thinking, but there was that urge, and okay, I started the psychology course, and I became very quickly disillusioned in the sense there was no God. Where was God in this? How could I possibly understand and become a psychologist, whatever that meant, without God? It was essential, and that's what I felt. And so I would read anything that was given to me. I paid to talk to psychologists, psychoanalysts, psychotherapists. I would pay to, do you believe in God? none of them did. And I became more and more frustrated. Fortunately, one of the contacts that my sister and my brother-in-law, with their sort of moving out, associating with artists and writers, poets and so forth, one of them was an Oswald Hall, who actually was a Barber lover in Melbourne, who very early in the piece had learnt about Barber. We would talk. And he didn't tell me about Barber, but he gave me he suddenly in the middle, around the second year at the university, when I was getting very concerned, how could I finish psychology and end up as a psychologist when I felt totally inadequate. And he lent me a book, Prophets of New India, the story of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. And I read that, I thought, oh my God, this is fantastic. I mean, it really caught my attention, in the sense that Jesus had always been so remote from my time, my years in the church, and my reading. I had no concern, but here, almost in my lifetime, was somebody actually, and he then, Oswald then, because of my interest in that book. Are you all right?
Oh, I'm good, yes.
Because of my interest in the book, he took me to meet some people. That's all he said. And it turned out to be Dr. Dennis O'Brien, Dennis and Joan O'Brien. And I thought they were nice people, but so what? I wanted God. And they said, well, would you like to meet the leader? I'd forgotten how they described the Baron von Frankenberg. But I said, yes, all right. I would meet anyone that might give me enlightenment, that might help me. And so I can remember going into he was at a hotel. I went into his room and I walked in, I saw this figure at a distance. I thought, he's got something. I don't know what it is, but he's got something. I felt drawn to him. And he talked to me, and it indicated that he meant something to me, because in the end he said, well, are you prepared to obey me? And I said, yes. He said, give up smoking for 3 months. And I did, Anyway, he said, this might have been the test, but anyway, he said, attend the candidate classes before joining what turned out to be the Sufi Society, which had been established by Inayat Khan, whom Baba confirmed was a fifth plane saint, who had been directed by his master, I've forgotten the name, to go to the West and spread the message of Sufism. It's all so intriguing. I mean, how Baba was at work, all this going on, and so I attended the first meeting, and I can remember the paper that had been given by Inayat Khan, and it was called The Intoxication of Life. I can still remember the title because that's what it is, you know. That's such an interesting title. That's exactly what happens with us. We get intoxicated with this creation and its ornaments and its anyway. So I attended the class, and at the end of the meeting, which, you know, I liked, okay, but at the end of it, somebody, I don't know who it was, but one of the people there thrust into my hand a little book, a thin little book, and said, "You might like to read this." And I said, sure, I would read anything at this stage. And it was book 2 of the 5-volume set of discourses. And that was my introduction to Barber. And so then I continued the meetings. And you could say that, yes, Barber was a part of it, but I was caught up with the whole new reading. I mean, Sufism, Barber, Sufism, you know, it was a whole new life. And at the same time, there was no question about me not finishing the course. I did finish and gained a BA in psychology. So that was fine. I didn't regard myself as a psychologist, but at least I had a piece of paper which gave me work, and I enjoyed working in. I would go into personnel management in those days of factories. I remember textile mills that I was in, and I was happy. Yeah. At the same time, still searching. You know, I wanted more. And I married, and we had children, and then I should go back. In the next year, I was still studying. Francis Brabazon came down from Sydney, and he had returned from America. The Baron, in order to gain more knowledge of Barber, he was told, that's another subject. Yes, Baron sent Francis to America to study under the Murshida of Sufism, the Sufi society, Rabia Martin, who was a sincere person. Now, I'll have to digress. Very, very briefly, Rabia Martin, named as successor by Inayat Khan to the Sufi society, was a sincere person, and although she told the Baron, for example, she arranged for the Baron to start the branch of the Sufi society in Australia, and she came to Australia and was with him. At the same time, she felt inadequate, that she was not a true teacher at the right level, at the level that she felt confident that she knew what she was doing. And so she searched, and in her search, I'm shortening it, in her search she found Maya Barber by listening to Norina Machabali talking about Maya Barber in New York. And she then had continuing contact with them. It's a lovely story in itself, and how she would visit them and stay with them in New York, and then when Myrtle Beach was established, she went down to visit them at Myrtle Beach and was actually on the centre. helping in some way, but I'm not sure. So Frances returned. She died,
Right.
48. And Frances returned and came to Melbourne and talked about May Obama. And I thought, here is one who I felt the conviction of love for May Obama, and was active. He was sort of saying, we've got to do something. And I liked it. And so thereafter I remained in contact with him, in touch with him. And when with the Baron's money, he purchased land at Beacon Hill to begin building a house, which he hoped Barbara would come to and stay there, live in that house, and at the same time be in Australia. And that appealed to me. So I would travel with Joan, my wife, poor soul. I mean, it was not easy because they were old cars, and we travelled very slowly on old roads. The roads were not the highways they are now.
Beacon Hill has changed a lot since
Yeah,
then.
and travelling from Melbourne to Sydney in order to help to be with Francis and help him build is about 600 miles, and it was a lot of hardship, and we lived in a tent, and Joan put up with a lot. Anyway, okay, that continued. By 1953, I was fed up with Melbourne. Nothing was happening, not happening enough. I wanted the one active place was Sydney, with Francis building this house, and with the obvious possibility of Barbara coming there. How to move to Melbourne, how to move to Sydney from Melbourne. I was already helping carpenters to build a house in Melbourne. I worked, apart from my other work, earning work, I would help. Barbara would the carpenters would direct me on what to do, and I would do it. In 1953, I was restless. What to do? How to get to Sydney? I was walking in the streets of Melbourne. This is where it's Barbara's really his touch, and all of a sudden, for no apparent reason, I don't know why I was even in the city, but I came face to face with a man 20 years older than me, whom I knew. We knew each other from the university course in psychology 5 years ago. I hadn't seen him for 5 years. And we suddenly meet, and he said, how we greeted each other, and he said, I've just been made Director of Army Psychology. Would you like a job as a psychologist in the Army? See, and I said, oh God, no. I immediately reared back and said, no, I don't, And I didn't even regard myself as a psychologist. I didn't refer to myself as that. And isn't it beautiful how Barbara, his touch. A fortnight later, for no apparent reason, I'm walking in that same street in Melbourne, and I meet him again. I mean, talk about, the odds. We meet again, and of course Barbara put it into my head. I said, what, would you give me a job in Sydney? Oh, no trouble at all. It didn't mean anything to him. And of course this meant that the government paid for my transfer to Sydney. Not only that, but in transferring, I sold the house. Actually, I sold it to a barber couple, the Adams, Stan and Clarice Adams. You may have heard the name. Who had been with Francis helping him. They wanted to return to Melbourne, and so they moved into that house. And for the first time in my life, I actually had £700. I had a capital. So the day I arrived in Sydney, the beginning of June, 1954. And I'd arranged to meet Francis in a cafe in the city, and I walked in, and Francis saw me come in the door and got up from the cubicle, the thing where he was sitting, and came toward me and just gave me a piece of paper, and that piece of paper said, "Males over the age of 16 who love me can come to be with me in September." 1954. Oh, I mean, yeah, I was overwhelmed. I thought, oh my God, I've got this opportunity. I had the money. Yeah. So that's how I came to meet Barbara. And okay, so I'd only just been in the army. I mean, I'd already, and I was a captain. Being a psychologist, I found myself as a captain. And so, of course, overjoyed, absolutely out of this world, I rang this chap, forgotten his name, the director, and said, oh, I want 6 weeks leave. We'd worked out what was needed to go, the money that we had, I was able to pay for myself, and I gave the rest of the money, apart from leaving for Joan and the kids that had been born by this time. Enough for them, and I had enough for half of Francis' ticket, so that was Francis and myself, and yes, yeah. So I rang him and said I need 6 weeks leave. He said, to go to India. He said, oh, there was hesitation, sort of wonderment on the phone, sort of like, what's this? And a couple of days later he rang back and said, sorry, leave denied, because of course India was close to Russia at that time. They were talking. And they were concerned, what was I up to? And I got excited. I shouted into the phone. I said, I'm going. No matter what, I'm going. I'm going to see my spiritual master, Mayor Barber. He said, all right, I could remember now. All right, Bill, keep your shirt on. I would have swum to get there, and he said, all right, and so he went to the top man and said, he's an idiot, but give him. I don't know what he said, but I gained permission, and so that's how I came to meet Barbara in 1954, and I had accepted, I had from the very beginning. Oh yes, from the very, thanks Dana. From the very beginning, I don't know why, but I had accepted Barbara, as far as I was concerned. Yeah, it's so logical, so right. God doesn't come just once in one part of the world, in total. Yeah, and so I had accepted him, and what could I say? I was very serious about it, like like a student. And so when I went in 54, I went with notebooks and pencils to write down everything that Barbara said. And so my first meeting, it's interesting. I'm all right. Bombay, we arrive in Bombay. We travelled up in the bus. You see it in the film. But what's not in the film is that I can remember arriving at Mehrabad at the railway line, and we got down and walked up, and it was dark, and yet that atmosphere. Yeah. I didn't know what it was, but there was a certain atmosphere, magical, warm. Yeah. And and so then the next morning we were taken in to Ahmednagar, to the Wadia Park. It was a big area, open area in those days, and a dais had been built, and it was all sort of open there and already people had started to gather when we got there before 9.
What month was this?
9 o'clock, eh?
So what month, time of year?
I'm sorry, September.
Okay.
We arrived on the 10th, which was what Barbara had said.
Right.
To arrive, the beginning, and we travelled up on the 11th, and the 12th of September was the darshan program, and okay, all of a sudden there was a cry, "Oh, Barbara's coming," and I went across from where we were standing, I don't know, as a group, and I went across to the edge of the dais, the platform. And so I was looking down as Barbara's car was driven up just below me. And I watched as this figure emerged. And it was so natural. There was no... It just... In one sense, it was so natural, so ordinary, and yet, at the same time, my attention was riveted on this figure that was so just got out. Papa, Jesawala, Erich's father, had his arm to help him, and how Barbara just gently tapped it with a little gesture. It's okay, I'm all right. I don't know, but it was so beautiful, so beautifully done. All I can say is that although I didn't weep, I didn't swoon, I didn't I didn't have visions or anything. At the same time, all I could say was, I'm going to follow that figure.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I want to say at this point, so it's 11:05. Did you want to? Should we continue with Bill?
Continue with Bill.
And then, we can do the prayer and the silence and all that. I'm not sure if you got time later after all
Sure,
that. Is
sure,
that
sure,
okay?
sure. Fine,
Have
fine,
you got
yes.
time? Okay, so
Okay, yeah, good.
yeah, because I don't want to cut you short.
Don't
either.
worry.
Okay.
Or
all right.
I can do it anytime.
Okay. All right.
Don't hesitate to... I'm saying
tell-
this
tell-
is being recorded.
Oh no, it's okay. We can cut all this.
No.
Tell us if you need a break too. If you want to go.
No,
stretch your legs
but
a
let
little.
me tell you
Please.
about my meeting with Barbara. That's
Absolutely.
all,
We'll just
and I'll
finish.
finish at that.
Absolutely.
Okay. In other words, yes, I was caught up. Yes, but then Barbara walked from the car into the crowd, waiting at the end of the dais, and then he was escorted up, and I can remember him being seated on this a chair, an armchair, on the dais, and we were given chairs, ordinary wooden chairs, quite comfortable, and we were placed in an arc behind Barbara, about 10, 12 feet, perhaps 15 feet behind. And we were seated there because of the others were older. I was the second youngest. There was one other Australian who came, John Ballantyne, who had the money. He was very new to Barbara, hadn't read very much at all, but he was attracted and came. And I was directly behind Barbara. And at a certain point, there were speeches being made, things going on, welcoming program. And at a certain point, I noticed Barbara's plait of hair tucked into the collar. I sort of riveted. I thought, oh, it was as though I'd noticed for the first time. And at that point, why I don't know, but whatever it was, at that point, Barbara suddenly turned round, as though, people had come to see me. He'd never looked. There was no contact at all with the 18 Westerners that had come. and again, that I can remember that movement. It was so decisive, so precise, and yet always so graceful. There was never any jerk or awkward movement. Always very graceful. Anyway, he turned and apparently looked at the men on my left, and then he looked at me, and I have no doubt that was my meeting with Barbara. His eyes went into me like two shafts, they pierced me through, and it was as though there was sort of emptiness. And also at the same time that I was pinned back by this, and I felt a shock through my body. And that was it. I don't remember. He must then moved on, but I have no recollection. And then the next thing I remember, the only thing that I remember was then Barbara sitting himself on the edge of the dais, and the darshan program began. Yeah, so that's it.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
There's plenty more of him about like his personal interview with Barbara and all those kind of things.
Oh yeah, the time I was very serious, and of course, as I told you, Barbara would come, and I wrote everything down. There was, how would I put it? There was a time I felt very awkward in terms of the rest of the Westerners. They all were They were older than me. They had already met Barbara, Francis particularly, and I felt very inadequate and juvenile. I mean, sort of, and and they were talking about the experiences of, you know, the waves of love that they'd experienced, what they'd experienced, and I wasn't. Nothing happened with me. And I remember in the beginning thinking, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I'm here. I'm just happy to be here. All right. I just want to be with Barbara. That's all right. Okay. And so when Barbara, the first day that we were with Barbara, he suddenly stopped the program and said, "Now each of you can say something about being here." And when my turn came, I just said, "Barbara, I'm just, something." In other words, I didn't attempt to say anything other than I'm just happy to be here. And Barbara said, or I have nothing to say other than that, or something like that. But Barbara answered and said, "He who expects nothing receives everything." Not that it meant anything to me at the time, but looking back, it was sort of how lovely Barbara sort of answered what one was going through. Yeah. And my writing up, I wrote everything down that Barbara said. It's in my book. And Barbara suddenly stopped one morning. He stopped and suddenly pointed like this to John and I. John Ballantyne, the other young Australian, was sitting. We were sitting next to each other. He pointed like that and said, "These two lads have a love for truth." And then he directed that we were to sit in the tomb. It was called the dome or the tomb at that time. And I was to sit there at midnight, sit still, not move, have my eyes open and inwardly take his name. So I said, "Yes, Barbara." Whatever Barbara asked. In the interview that I'd had where he had said, "Would you walk through the streets of Nugget naked if I told you to?" I said, "Yes." I mean, all I can say is, and then in '56 when he suddenly said, "Bill, do you love me?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, would you throw your 3 children into the ocean if I told you to?" And I said, "Yes." I don't know. All I know is that I would do whatever he asked. And so I just said, "Yes, Barbara." So at midnight, we were taken down. There was no electricity then. There were no animals. There was no people moving around. There were no cars. Trains were not running at that time. And when Francis closed the door of the tomb, and the windows were already closed, it was absolutely pitch black. Not a chink of light. And not only a chink of light, but absolutely no sound. And my experience for that half hour that I was there was one of a sense of being, as it were, alone in the universe, that I had nothing. I felt what you might call a panic attack. I didn't move. I kept my eyes open, but such was my inner state that I couldn't take Barbara's name. And okay, the half hour finished. And and then the next morning, Barbara asked, had we done it, and yes. And then he asked, John felt nothing. The experience was obviously for me. And I couldn't say. I was inarticulate in those days. I wasn't able to talk as I can now, because only because Barbara sort of pushed me to talk. But I didn't. I couldn't say. And Barbara then gave her this lovely message, which basically means fear means no love. Love means no fear. And the fear was the fear of the unknown, of stepping away from the security that one has of the world. Do you follow me?
Yeah.
I won't let this go into detail in that, but that is so much the basis of my life. Always that, and the fact that Barbara is so right, that it's only love for him that will carry one through.
Mm.
So love him more and more, concentrate on him more and more, in every possible way. What did Barbara say? Create such an ache for me that in the heart that the ego is overcome. One's mind with its multifarious desires and impressions and yeah. Yeah, all right. J.
Are
Barbara.
you sure you don't want to do the interview?
What?
The personal interview? Because that involves Mayor House. And... No?
Oh.
You can go for it. I'm just conscious I don't want to stress you out.
But
Have a little more drink of water. And
yeah, please.
Have
We'll sit here until midnight tomorrow. But
No.
I don't want to.
You people can go if you wish, you know. You don't. The trouble is that once I start and I think of Barbara, it's hard for me to stop, because there were things that happened during those 3 weeks. It somehow or other, those 3 weeks stay with me. It's either the 3 weeks or it's 13 years later when I was with Barbara. I lived with him for a fortnight in Mayrazad, and it's either scenes from somehow the other 3 times in between. All sorts of things did happen. There's a whole history, but I tend to alternate between the beginning of it. And then that last, and Barbara, the change, the incredible change. Barbara was a man on a mission. He knew exactly what he was doing and where he was going, and it wasn't that he wasn't that in '67. Barbara was Barbara. But physically it was so changed.
When we saw you in Myrtle Beach, you told a story about driving Barbara around Sydney.
Yeah, yes.
Do you remember much of that? Can you tell us?
Yeah. Well, Barbara told me to keep my eyes on the road. When I started off, of course, Barbara was sitting alongside me, so I was sort of, going to drive and have a look at Barbara. And Barbara said, all right, Bill, you're a good driver, but keep your eyes on the road. So I did. And one time I was driving him. I drove him, it was a few hours, so one way or another, in and out of the airport, into the city, to visit homes, Barbara lover, there was a fair bit of activity. And And at one time, I was driving, and all of a sudden, all I can say is there was like a little bomb went off in my head. I thought, oh my God, this slight silent figure that's sitting alongside me is the only reality. The whole universe came out of him. I thought, I can't drive and think of that. I'll think of it tomorrow. I don't know why I said that tomorrow, but that was my, and Barbara and Erich, of course, was in the back seat, and Barbara gestured, and he immediately answered and said, yes, I am that. I am that. And he did say a number of other things, but it's funny, all I can remember is, I am that. And that's yes, he is God. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
That's great. Thank you, Bill.
well, yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of history, but hey, I think that's...
The personal interview.
What's that?
What were you saying?
3 incredible weeks.
Yeah,
Personal
do you want to talk
interview.
any about that?
All right.
Any-
Are you still okay? All right, I can remember coming in. We came in, you know, the West Room, where it's now the museum.
Mm.
You all right, Francis? Want a chair? And it was sort of like a very, very simple lounge where Barbara had a chair, and there was a little. We had, when we were with him there when he gave discourses, the chairs were put again because of the older ones. I could have sat on the floor quite easily, but and probably so some of the others, but there was, because of the age, it was chairs. But in this case, with the interview, the three of us came in together, John Ballantyne, Francis and myself. And I can remember coming in, and as we came towards Barbara gestured, Francis, you brought me 2 jewels. And it's incredible, that effect of those simple words. You sort of, oh, it's okay. You know, immediately you were embraced, you were home. And we sat down, and this was the first time that I'd been this close to Barbara, and I could see, you know, I could see able to see the features and I could see the lips even under the moustache. You know, you could see the details much more clearly. Francis was in the middle, and I was on his right, and John Ballantyne on his left. And so we sat down, and then Barbara looks at me and said, "Do you love me?" I said, "Yes, Barbara." "Will you obey me?" "Yes, Barbara." And that was when he said, "Will you walk through the streets of Nugget naked?" I can't remember the other 2, but whatever they were, it could have been. I know he's asked others, "Would you return immediately to Australia if I told you to?" You know, things like that. And whatever it was, I said yes. And there were various things that was the first time that he told me to spread his name and message. And I said, "Yes, Barbara." And then there were things that happened, such as he suddenly looked at John Ballantyne. As I told you, he was very new to Barbara, and hadn't read much, little background. Very, very sweet man, but very withdrawn, very introverted, and that was, yeah. And Barbara suddenly looked at him and said, "Who do you take me to be?" And John, I can remember now sort of, I thought, oh, I looked towards John and he sort of, it set him back. Oh, how to answer. And he obviously he didn't know what to say, and then finally sort of blurted out, a perfect master. And Barbara looked in such a gentle but puzzled way, how would you know? And I think, God, yes, that's right. How interesting. And I'm caught up with that thought of, it's all right, all very well to say it, but how would you know? And Barbara suddenly looked at me and asked me the same question. And to this day, I have no idea where it came from. Or I just said, Barbara, you are my ideal. You are what I would like to be myself. And Barbara beamed, how they became like the sun. Such a beautiful expression. And he then turned. Up to that point, I had no idea, and I know this is a common reaction with people, that I was not aware of. I thought he was speaking. I had not aware that he was silent, if you know what I mean. His face was so expressive. When whatever was said, you just felt it came from him, But he turned like this, and he gestured towards Erich, and for the first time, Erich's voice. He gestured, did you hear? It was sort of like a gesture, did you hear that? And I'm not quite sure whether he's saying, that's a new one, or whatever it was, but anyway, that was he turned to Erich at that point. And otherwise, there was. He didn't ask me about what my circumstances were. He didn't ask me whether I was married, whether I had children, whether I had a job, whether I was, had money. He suddenly, and now up to that point, I had nothing. But Barbara didn't ask me. But he suddenly turned to Francis and said, that house that you're building on Beacon Hill, hand it over to Bill, just like that. and that gave us the house. It was half finished. Okay, it was a bit, it was certainly rough, but at least we had a roof over our heads. Whereas the money that we had all gone. I didn't have a penny. By the time we got back, of course, Joan had whatever she was left with had spent with herself and the children. And then there were other things, and everything was fine. I loved it. I loved watching his face and the movements and the eyes. He looked at me as though like I look at you, or or we look at each other. But Barbara, you had the sense he saw me as a person, and yet he saw at the same time the eyes looked in and within, and at the same time it's as though there was nothing. It was beyond it was everything, everywhere. There was nothing there. I don't know how to. It was personal and absolutely impersonal. But it was so lovely with that, and I was so happy. Oh yeah, this could go on forever. And then, and just as we were at the end of the interview, Barbara suddenly looked at me and said, "Do what Francis tells you." And at that point, my heart sank down to my boots, I thought, oh my God, this means trouble, which it did, but very good for me. Okay, J Barber.
Hey, Barbara.
J
Thank you.
Barber.